When I first played Elden Ring, one of the first points of lore that interested me was Queen Marika. She is a figure shrouded in mystery from the very beginning, someone who seemingly vanished at a moment of great calamity, a situation made all the more interesting when we consider she is the god of the current era, and her influence is everywhere. Her absence is a noticeable vacuum, punctuated by the bones of the fallen civilization that was built in her name and image. Her mystery only deepens when we learn the truth of her dual nature, and that it was she who shattered the Elden Ring. Despite her being such a central figure, we learn very little about her backstory and how she rose to power, aside from a few tantalizing connections. Shadow of the Erdtree finally revealed some of her origin story, and for me this was one of the main strengths of the DLC's lore. We are introduced to the Shamans, Marika's people, who are a fascinating culture that existed in the shadow of the Hornsent before Marika met the Fingers and usurped power for herself. Perhaps of most interest is the Shaman's relationship to trees, which can be used to explain much of Marika's nature and relationship to the Erdtree. I will also suggest that the concept of monoecious trees can also be used to explain Radagon's origins and how he has always been part of Marika. Marika's past is incredibly revealing and fundamental for our greater understanding of how the Golden Order and Erdtree came to be, as well as what it means for the cyclical nature of the world. So join me this week as we dive into the lore of Marika and the Shamans, and examine how it affects our understanding of the base lore. But remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as I have hours of lore content for you to enjoy. Before we dive any further into the lore, I would like to give an update from today's sponsor, me, as I once again present my Elden Ring lore book, Grace Given. For those unaware, I have collaborated with the team at Toon and Fairweather to produce a 500-page book on the lore of Elden Ring. The various editions are augmented by the stunning works of talented artists like Shimhack, Elliot Wells, Menace LG, and Chris Lewis Lee. I am happy to announce that the pre-orders for the limited and collector's edition books will be shipping soon, as I have received my own copy now and can confirm they are worth waiting for. Additionally, I am proud to announce some new editions that have gone up for pre-sale now, including a softcover version and a deluxe edition with this beautiful Astel sleeve. If you would be interested in adding this collector's item to your bookshelf, then please check out the links below. And I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone for the incredible support in this project. Thank you for listening, and now back to the lore. Marika's origins have always been a fascinating mystery, especially when we consider the base game lore surrounding her kin, the Numen. The Numen's rune tells us that they are indeed Marika's stock, but that they also come from outside the lands between. Additionally, we have the appearance preset for the Numen, which also reinforces the idea that this race, Marika's bloodline, do not originate in the lands between. There are other semantic conclusions that we could draw from the wording used. In the Japanese script, the Numen are referred to as Marabito, which is a term used to describe spirits who come from another world. I believe that the English term Numen is meant to allude to the Númenóreans, those men from Lord of the Rings who also came to Middle-earth from another place, Númenor, and while they are humans, they are long-lived. Rather than diving too deeply into either translation, holistically both terms are meant to illustrate the fact that Marika is not from the lands between originally, and that her race are distinct from the regular human races. Indeed, Shadow of the Erdtree reaffirmed this, by showing us that Marika came from the lands of Shadow, and from a community of spiritual humanoids called the Shamans. While the Numen would become the name of Marika's descendants, she herself came from a people known as the Shamans. We come to learn of this when we arrive at the village of Shamans, the hometown of said people. In a meadow in the village, we find the minor Erdtree incantation, which tells us this was cast by Marika in her hometown. This is her hometown. Marika is a shaman. The importance of this location to the Golden Order is clear by how well it is protected, preserved, and hidden. After all, this is where their god comes from. At the onset of this segment, I do want to acknowledge my script editor Ash, who was the one who first presented the ideas of Shaman being akin to monoecious trees, and the Miranda prayer connection to me. Both these, as you will see, have had a profound impact on the following segments, and I want to give them full credit. The Shaman's connection to trees is undeniable, and we will talk about that in depth shortly, but first I want to talk about their innate spiritual qualities. Even the name of their race is a clue to this, as the term shaman usually implies a connection to certain spiritual or religious practices, and for me it is meant to indicate that they have religious practices that have a connection to nature and or trees. It also implies that they are inherently spiritual, as the term for shamans in the Japanese script refers to shrine maidens, those who commune with Shinto deities in Japanese culture. So even in the semantics of their name, we learn something about the author's intent. Indeed, Marika's bloodline seems to have a strong connection to spirits, and while we will talk about melding and physical grafting a lot, it is also clear that they attune to spirits just as easily. In our journey, we meet Roderica, and she eventually becomes a spirit tuner. Hugh is the one who trains her to do this, saying that he recognizes her ability because she reminds him of a spirit tuner he once knew.
The girl you brought here, she's crestfallen and can scarcely swing a blade, but she has a gift for spirit tuning. I saw another one like her long ago. Their eyes share the same hue.
Now, in the past I have overlooked this statement, but what if the spirit tuner he knew was none other than Marika? We know Hugh had contact with Marika, as she was the one who imprisoned him here and instructed him to assist the Tarnished. We get examples of Marika's bloodline being able to trap or graft spirits in a couple of places, which could eventually translate to spirit tuning. First we have the Erdtree itself, essentially an extension of Marika, which seems to be able to trap the remembrance of those who have died within it, as can the Skadu tree, a fragment of their spirit being etched into the Erdtree. We also get evidence from the jar process that the shamans are subjected to, and we will talk more about it shortly. But in short, Marika's people are used as the central binding agent of these abominations, and other condemned are cut up and stuck to them, mainly because the flesh of shamans has melding qualities. However, we learn that not only the flesh of others stick to them, but so too do their spirits, as the innard meat reads the following: scraps of flesh for filling great jars. Rancorous spirits cling to the pinkish red convulsing meat. The rancorous spirits of the victims cling to the flesh of the shamans, because of their innate spiritual qualities, and this could remind us of a certain demigod. I am of course referring to Rykard and his rancorous spirits. He is an indirect child of Marika via her male half being Radagon, and so Rykard is essentially one of her children as well, and thus subject to inheriting her genetics. Rykard shows an ability to graft, as when he devours various heroes, they merge with him, stuck in a torturous state of persistent life within his flesh, and adding their power to his. It isn't just their flesh that melds with him, however, but also their spirit. During his fight with us, he is able to send rancorous spirits at us like a missile. We are able to recreate Rykard's rancor from his remembrance, and it reads the following: these spirits manifest from the rancor of heroes who met a violent end. The Lord granted them an audience, whereupon they were welcomed by the maw of the great serpent, and within the serpent's bowels they became the Lord's kin. These spirits are essentially trapped and under Rykard's command, clinging to his flesh, much like the spirits found on the jar innards. In conclusion, we have evidence that spirits are able to meld and cling to the flesh of shaman kind, and thus bringing it back to Roderica. We also see a similar fate in her men, who are grafted by one of Marika's descendants, Godric. The spirits of these men cling to the chrysalids memento, and I would say this is a side effect of Godric's grafting process, which is essentially the same as the Shaman melding process. I therefore believe that spirit tuning is something that has its origins with Marika's people due to their innate relationship to spirits, and as such is the spirit tuner Hugh is referring to. The Shamans seem to be tree-like in their very physiology, given they seem to grow into trees over time. The greatest example of this is the woman found in Shaman Village, who is now a large tree. Upon her body we find the golden braid talisman, which speaks of a grandmother. Thus we can assume this woman is said grandmother. Grandmother is likely a title denoting her position as an elder within Marika's community, similar to the grandam of the Hornsent. And if she is one of the eldest of her kind, then perhaps it explains her advanced state as a tree. Perhaps the older a shaman gets, the further their transition into tree form advances, and thus this elder of Marika's village is barely even a humanoid anymore. Perhaps it is these unusual properties that make the shamans useful material for melding and grafting, given tree sap is a natural adhesive. I also mentioned the Numen earlier, the race of beings who are descended from Marika, and thus the Shamans. One of their most notable attributes is their long-lived nature, again something that can be explained if they are literally tree people, given trees are one of the most long-lived forms of life in the real world, with the oldest tree being almost 5,000 years old. Their inherent tree nature also explains why Marika's god-given power manifests naturally as a tree, as it is a reflection of her innate nature. It is why she is able to manifest the minor Erdtree incantation, and it is why the nexus of her power took the form of two trees. But perhaps it can also explain another mystery, that of Marika and Radagon. For the longest time I have argued that Radagon never existed as his own person, and likely became a component of her when she ascended to godhood. I had many reasons to believe this, one of the main being the concept of the alchemical rebis, the magnum opus of the field, where all opposites are reconciled and combined into one perfect and immortal being, male and female, fire and water, sulfur and mercury, the passive and the active, the union of the Red King and the White Queen. It is hard to ignore the aesthetic choice here, that clearly alludes to Marika's union to Radagon, and I do think part of this choice is to emphasize Marika's godhood, given the rebis is immortal and perfect, a holistic being in which all matter is reconciled and purified. Additionally, we know that Marika's order is one of opposites, gold and shadow, represented by the two trees that she would gestate when she became a god and vessel for the Elden Ring. Thus I have theorized in the past that when she created this order of duality, she created a duality within herself, and thus Radagon came into being. This is still very much possible, and would like to emphasize that I am not necessarily saying I don't believe it anymore. Rather, I am considering another possibility. What if Radagon didn't come into being because of the order of duality, but his existence with Marika, before she even became a god, was what made her order one of duality? Trees are interesting forms of life, especially in regards to reproduction. Trees do have sexes, and some forms of tree do have separate sexes, i.e. some trees are female and some are male. These are known as dioecious trees. However, there are trees known as monoecious, and these trees are not one gender, rather they have both sexes but within the same structure. Examples of this would be oak and birch, and these trees do not need a separate pollinator for their reproductive needs, they are self-sufficient. Does this not very much sound like Marika and Radagon's single-bodied reproduction that led to the birth of Malenia and Miquella? Marika being of a race of tree people fits really nicely here because it opens up the possibility that Marika's race were monoecious, and thus Radagon has always been a part of her from the moment she was born. If he was always part of her, and she has always existed as a duality, then perhaps this is why her order manifested as a duality as well. When she ascended to godhood and became the vessel for the Elden Ring, her order manifested as a reflection of her, as two halves with two trees. We see some of the elements of the Shamans passed down to her bloodline. For example, we can see that the melding quality of her flesh made its way to Godric, who is able to graft others' body parts to his own person. Then we have Miquella, who seems to have inherited his mother's dual state of being, having both a female and male persona within him. We can also further theorize on where the Shamans first came from, and the answer may come from a cut item that relates to the Miranda flowers, Miranda's prayer. This cut item would have explained why these flowers are named as such, as it reads the following. This statuette depicts a flower that preys on humans, posed in prayer. Miranda, Maiden of the Flower Crucible, is said to have been the very first of this breed. Miranda was reportedly the first of a certain breed, and we can see in the item icon itself that it appears to be a woman, a human-flower hybrid. An important distinction to highlight is that the Shamans seem to be more closely associated with the botanical elements of the Crucible, compared to the bestial horn scent. The horn scent placed more importance on divine beasts and horns, i.e. the fauna elements of nature. Conversely, the Shamans seem to be representative of the flora side of nature and the Crucible. We know that all of these are aspects of the Crucible, with fauna represented by tail and horn, and flora being represented by bloom. Returning to Miranda, it could have been that she was the first of Shaman kind, a new human botanical breed that emerged from the Flower Crucible, alongside these Miranda flowers, with Miranda herself being an evolutionary bridge from plant kind to shaman kind. It would certainly explain a number of connections between the Miranda flowers and Marika's lineage. Marika's daughter, Melina, even uses this incantation in our battle with Morgott, and it is an incantation that the Miranda flowers themselves can also innately use. Saint Trina, a child of Marika, is herself a flower, in the most literal sense. The description of Miranda's prayer also emphasizes the fact that these flowers prey on humans, and indeed we know from the Miranda powder that these flowers are man-eaters. But if Marika is related to them, and the Erd and Skadu trees are manifestations of her inner nature, then perhaps it also explains why both trees absorb people. They too devour men for sustenance. For clarity, I am referring to the practice of Erdtree burial, in which dead humanoids are buried at the base of the tree, and then are seemingly absorbed by the roots. Perhaps this man-eating habit is due to Marika's relation to the Miranda flowers. This also brings us into a discussion of the Crucible itself. In the past, I and others have spoken of a Crucible, singular. However, the item, Talisman of all Crucibles, suggests that there may well have been multiple Crucibles. Miranda's prayer speaks of a flower crucible specifically, and as such I believe it was from this specific botanical-based crucible that the Shamans first emerged from. Shaman Village is not an easy area to access. The Shadow Keep is a later construction of Marika's faction that is designed to maintain control over the conquered lands of the Hornscent. However, it plays an additional role in keeping the truth of Shaman Village shrouded, as the keep is built in such a way that Marika's homeland is sequestered off behind high walls. It is hidden and protected by the Shadow Keep, as well as 2 Erdtree sentinels. But this is not a celebrated and public holy site, rather it is a secret kept well buried by the Golden Order. The Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god.
The Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god.
That is that she is the sole true divinity. If the truth of her humble and manufactured origins were to become public, then this foundational principle would be shattered, and others would seek to become divine as she did, and become her rival. This is one of the reasons the lands of Shadow are sealed. The Tower of Aner Illim is shrouded, and the village of Shamans is hidden. It is all to obfuscate the truth of Marika, the truth that she is not truly divine, rather she is just someone who sees power. So with that said, let us peel back the shroud and look at the Shamans, and how they existed under the rule of the Hornsent. I do have a full video on the Hornsent and their culture, which I would highly recommend, but in short, the DLC presents the Hornsent as the dominant culture that existed prior to Marika's Golden Order. The Erdtree is the dominant icon of worship today, yet it only came about following Marika's Ascension, and in the time prior to her rule, the Crucible was the force which commanded worship. This is something we already knew from the base game, but it is reinforced by the Hornsent's close relationship to the Crucible. We can first of all see this in their symbolic representation of the Spiral and Spiral Tree. We know from Spira and the Spiral Tree seal that this is how the Hornsent view the Crucible. Thus we see it everywhere. Aeneir Illim itself is built as a spiral in order to emulate the form of the Crucible, showing how central it was to their religious and cultural beliefs. We also know even from the base game that contact with Crucible often results in horn growth, but that this is a negative thing in the age of the Erdtree, given contact with the Crucible is no longer seen as divine. Conversely, in the time of the Hornsent, this type of growth was seen as divine. For example, we have the Fine Crucible Feather Talisman, which reads the following: "The Hornsent view the Crucible as sacred for the refinement wrought through its evolutionary gifts, most prominently their tangled horns. Hence the Hornsent even uses horns as their currency, and while we could continue to discuss the nuances of their belief system, the long and the short of it is that they were a culture that primarily worshipped the Crucible and had very particular beliefs centered around it. The Crucible and its bestial manifestations were venerated, and we see this most prominently in the importance they place on horns, and via their divine beast worship and warrior practices. Such strong beliefs are held up by dogmatic practices, which we see in the Hornsent's intolerant treatment of other beliefs that deviate from the state religion. The very existence of an Inquisition is proof of this. Given in the real world, the Spanish Inquisition was a movement meant to enforce religious uniformity by investigating reports of heresy and apostasy. The Hornsent Inquisitors do the same. We see this in the case of Midra and his followers, who are brutally put to the sword for dabbling with the flame of frenzy, albeit this is a dangerous material that does need to be contained, but it is their brutal methodology that I want to call attention to. A very apt piece of lore, and one I have pointed out a lot in my videos, is the line found in the Great Sword of Damnation's Ash of War, which reads the following: "There is something of the Golden Order in the sight of those fixed upon this crux." The point of this statement is to point out the cyclical nature of the world of Elden Ring. Just as Marika and her kin suffered under the Hornsent, so too would her order eventually become cruel and intolerant to those deemed divergent. We see further evidence of the Hornsent's treatment of those who deviate from the state religion in their jar jails, seemingly their main containment and punishment centres for those deemed heretical. We see this mainly through the final bosses and loot found in each. For example, we find Curseblade Labyrinth in Bonnie Jail, a member of a cult known as the Curseblades, who lived an ascetic lifestyle in an attempt to become tutelary deities. Their practices are what led them to become the fearsome warriors they are today, though it is clear they were not accepted by the Hornsent authorities, likely because their belief system was seen as a threat to the state religion. We learn of their persecution via Curseblade Mira's Ash, which reads the following: "Long ago, before the land was overshadowed by invasion, this scourge was shunned, and the Curseblades were imprisoned. It was during this confinement that Mira met Labyrinth, and upon her death, Labyrinth was plunged into a devastating darkness." Likewise, in Lamenter's jail we find another cult group imprisoned. The Lamenters, again we have to presume this group was persecuted for the same reason as the Curseblades, for having a belief system that deviated from the state religion. I do also find it interesting that in Belorat jail we find a demi-human swordsman, perhaps implying that the Hornsent also saw this race as lesser to them. much as the Golden Order would persecute the Misbegotten and Omen for being lesser. The purpose of highlighting all of this is to show that the Hornsent were an oppressive and dominant force, that were highly intolerant and cruel to those who do not align with their belief set, and this explains their cruel treatment of the Shamans. For the jails in the Lands of Shadow do not just contain prisoners, but they are also sites where the gruesome practice of the potentates take place, and the Shamans are an important ingredient in this macabre recipe. We know that the practice of the St. Jars is a Hornsent one, because of the potentates, the individuals who oversee the process. We meet a number of them in Bonny Village, and we can see they are wearing the caterpillar mask. Not only can we see the signature horns poking through the mask, but it is also the mask worn by the Hornsent of Miquella's companions, outright confirming this practice is a Hornsent one, if there was ever any doubt. It seems as though this practice originated in Bonny Village. This is the location where we find the potentates, it's where we find the whipping shed, and there is a jar jail nearby. We get some in-game lore that implies this was a practice of this village specifically, rather than a general Hornsent one, and this comes via the Greater Potentate Cookbook, which reads the following: a record of crafting techniques of the Greater Potentate who roamed lands near and far. Haunted by the grotesque practice of his village of birth, he stuffed great pots with all manner of things. While we can still see that the practice is centered on this village, it has spread far and wide within the domain of the Hornsent, with a jar jail being found directly below Belorat itself. There seems to be several stages to this process, in which the Shamans play an integral role, something we learn from the Tooth Whip item description, which reads the following: whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth. Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of Shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others, so the flesh of Shamans is special and acts almost like a bonding agent, like a glue for the flesh mixture that goes in the jars. Thus, they are a critical ingredient. In order for this property to be brought to the forefront, the Shamans are tenderized by the Tooth Whip. The infected open wounds would cause their flesh to ooze, making it a more malleable material. As we discussed in the prior chapter, I believe the Shamans to be tree people, and as such, this process could be seen as making air sap ooze and come to the surface of their flesh. The Bonny butchering knife also suggests that other body parts were cut up at the village, and I therefore speculate that other non-shaman prisoners would be cut up and added to the shaman meld, to create a Frankenstein-esque being made up of many people, with the Shamans at the centre. Indeed, the item description for jar innards seems to confirm that those condemned in Hornsent society, likely criminals or apostates, were cut up and added to this vile mixture. This melding ability seems to be something unique to the Shamans, showing that Marika's race are unique among other humanoids, a thing already hinted to us in the base game, given her Numen descendants have very long lives and rarely produce offspring. Not only are the Shamans chosen for this unique punishment because of the utility of their flesh, but they are also subjected to such punishment because the Hornsent see the Shamans as lesser. We get this via a ghost dialogue, a ghost found at the aptly named Whipping Shed, found outside of Bonny Village. It was here that the tenderization process would take place, and this ghost seems to be speaking down to a shaman he is whipping. He says the following: "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nay, sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone. The Hornsent who is whipping the shaman seems to believe the latter is so lesser, that they should be grateful for this treatment, that becoming a jar is somehow an elevated state of being than that of a shaman. As I have noted in prior videos, I find it very interesting that the shamans at the centre of the jar innards have some sort of brand on their forehead. I believe this to be some sort of branding administered by the Hornsent to mark people as shamans, a brand that marks them as a lesser form of life. There is also a note found outside the entrance to Shaman Village, which states, "Have mercy for these spirited away shamans." To me, this suggests that the shamans were literally snatched from their village in order to be turned into jar saints. We understand the general reason for this. It is in line with the Horn Saint's dogmatic view of other races and belief systems, and they likely despise the shamans for their druidic-like beliefs. The shamans seem to be related to a different element of Crucible, more closely linked to the botanical or tree aspect of it, whereas the Horn Saint are more focused on the bestial aspect. Perhaps this divergence in practice was simply intolerable for the Horn Saint and they couldn't let it stand. But why this specific punishment? Well, as I have suggested in prior videos, I believe that these jars are a sort of homage to the Crucible itself, given the Horn Saint's worship of its power. We know from various item descriptions that the Crucible was a place in which life was once all blended together. In the ghost dialogue we examined earlier, he refers to becoming a jar as nigh sainthood, implying there is something sacred about this form. Indeed, this is reinforced by the Great Jar Helm, which reads the following: "A great jar, which fits comfortably over the head when upturned. Attire of the shamans who perform their worship at jails. They offer their prayers to the innards of the great jars, such that they might be reborn one day into sainthood. This is the cycle of death and rebirth, taken into the hands of mortal men." Just as an aside, the term shaman here is just an unfortunate translation. It is not the same word that is meant to denote the shaman people. Rather, it is meant to represent a priest or witch doctor of this practice. This directly confirms that the jar practice was not only used to oppress those that were deemed lesser, but also was a sort of cult practice, in my opinion, the blending together of materials to imitate the Crucible. Taking this all together, we can understand the entire process of how a jar saint is made, from start to finish via all the item descriptions and dialogues we've looked at. The shamans are tenderized at the whipping shed, while the butchers of Bonny Village cut up and prepare the other victims. They are then delivered to the jar jails, where the jar priests oversee the ascension to nigh sainthood. In a way, we could see these jars as miniaturized avatars of the Crucible, and there are those who have presented compelling theories that this was actually how Marika was created, and this explains why she has two personalities, because she is two people spliced together via this process. While I do really like this theory, I personally believe that Marika's second personality is more likely a consequence of her tree nature, as we discussed in the prior chapter. As I have said, I believe the purpose of these jars was to imitate the Crucible and attempt to recreate its power. The Great Jar Helm even says that these jars are an example of mortals, trying to claim the cycle of death and rebirth for themselves, to artificially recreate it. As I will soon discuss, I do believe they were partially successful in these experiments, and it would eventually lead to a far larger application of these practices, resulting in the Gate of Divinity. It is hard not to notice the fact that the Gate of Divinity itself is a construction made of many people, and in the past, I had tried to claim that this was the result of the Crucible, that it was a point in space where the power of the Crucible coalesced, and thus it pulled all of these people together. However, as I often do, I have changed my position on this, and where I once believed that the gate was the result of the Crucible's power, I now believe the gate has power because it was constructed in a certain way. In a really interesting video, content creator Eric makes a compelling argument about the nature of its power. He suggests that life was once more concentrated, whether that be in the One Great or in the Crucible, where life was all blended together. Eric suggests that in this early form of oneness, power was whole, and as life dispersed and became disparate, so too did power. Thus Eric suggests that by concentrating so much life around the gate, it becomes a massive source of energy or power. This is close to what I believe now, and when we reach the chapter of Marika's Ascension, you will see that I argue that both the jars and the gateway create power, because of the concentration of energy, and it was this energy that Marika tapped into in order to ascend. But for now, I want to pause the conversation there and refocus on how this practice seemingly devastated the Shamans. They were a people harvested and rounded up. The Golden Braid item description reads the following. What was her prayer? Her wish? Her confession? There is no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home again. There was no one left to answer. To me, this paints a picture of Queen Marika returning to her village, either just before or after her ascension, and by this time, her village has gone quiet. There is no one left of her people, aside from the tree that was once her elder. The message outside their village takes on a more tragic meaning, as I believe all the shamans were purged and rounded up and either made into jars or used as a bonding agent for the gateway. The Numen are described as Marika's descendants. They themselves are not necessarily of the shaman culture, and I would therefore suggest that Marika is likely one of the last of the shamans, if not the last, with the vast majority of them being purged in the making of jars, or the Gate of Divinity. All in all, the jar practice of the horn scent is grotesque, and it is hard not to feel bad for Marika and her people's fate. A fate far worse than death, in my opinion, especially if the vast majority of her people ended up in the Gate of Divinity. Marika would survive the Shaman Purge, no doubt as a result of her alliance with Metyr and the Two Fingers. As an elected Empyrean, she would have received her shadow-bound beast, Malekith, a fearsome warrior who would have kept her safe. While her people were used in this grotesque construction, Marika and the Two Fingers conspired for her to take the gateway's power for herself. After all, it was her people's power, and thus her birthright, not the horn scents. There is something poetic about the mutilated remains of her people, being used to raise up the last of their kind over their oppressors. By the time Marika had overthrown the horn scent and claimed the power of the Elden Ring, there was no one left in her village to celebrate her victory. The shaman's position in the Lands of Shadow was far from ideal, under the heel of the horn scent, but the shaman village has an interesting position on the map, as it can be found next to one of the finger ruins. As we discussed in my Metyr video on the subject, these finger ruins actually grew, rather than them being a man-made construction. My conclusion is that they are a result of Metyr, the envoy of the Greater Will who came to this world even before the Elden Beast. The presence of the ruins so close to Marika means that it was almost inevitable that she would come into contact with Metyr's brood, and indeed she seemingly did. We already knew from the base game that Marika herself was once Empyrean, and as Ranni tells us, each Empyrean is chosen by a Two Fingers.
Each of us was chosen by our own Two Fingers, as a candidate to succeed Queen Marika, to become the new god of the coming age, which is when I received Blythe, in the form of a vassal tailored for an Empyrean.
However, we get further confirmation in the DLC that it was indeed the Two Fingers, Metyr's children, who gave guidance to Marika. Ymir, an expert in the fingers and the Greater Will, says the following of Marika's rise to power.
The conceits, the hypocrisy of the world built upon the Erdtree, the follies of men, their bitter suffering. Is there no hope for redemption? The answer, sadly, is clear. There never was any hope. They were each of them defective, unhinged from the start. Marika herself, and the fingers that guided her.
It was the Two Fingers that gave Marika the guidance to usurp the current order and establish the Golden Order. There is further confirmation that the Two Fingers were involved in the birth of the Erdtree that comes to us via the Crimson Seed Talisman +1, which reads the following. The Erdtree seed of this talisman was presumed to be an object of myth. This age-old artifact also depicts the Two Fingers, perhaps harking back to the birth of the Erdtree. The Two Fingers were directly responsible for Marika's rise to power, It was they who incited Marika to take power for herself, and it was the Two Fingers who guided her on her path to Ascension. In the base game, the Two Fingers essentially suggest that Marika is chosen by the greater will itself, and that these fingers speak for it. We long accepted this narrative, seeing the Two Fingers as the incontrovertible voice of God. Even in the base game, however, certain nuggets or lore hint to the truth, that the Two Fingers have lost contact with the greater will. Every bit of guidance they have given us and others is not the word of the divine, it is their own. A truth hidden from most, beside from the likes of Ymir, Gideon and Vari. Ymir suggests that Metyr was an unhinged and defective guide, and this makes sense when we examine the staff of the Great Beyond, which reads the following: staff fashioned from the tail fingers of Metyr, the mother of fingers, and the microcosm raised aloft over the crux they form. The mother receives signs from the greater will from the beyond of the microcosm. Despite being broken and abandoned, she kept waiting for another message to come. This means it was Metyr and her kin who had Marika rise to power, a plan of her devising with no input from the greater will. But why? Well, in my Metyr video, I collaborated with content creator Garrulous Goldmask, who suggested that Metyr may be envious of the Elden Beast, who in many ways has supplanted Metyr. Both came to the earth as a shooting star, both vessels of the greater will, but Metyr was the first. Given Metyr's seems to be associated with communication, my assumption has always been that Metyr came here first as a sort of vanguard for the greater will, setting up a communication link and reporting back the lay of the land. I also suggested in that video that Metyr may well have been worshipped as a god by early civilizations. After all, before the arrival of the Elden Ring and Elden Beast, Metyr was the sole earthly representative of the greater will. At this stage, Metyr and the Fingers will literally have been the mouth of God, and it is easy to imagine they would be worshipped as divine. We have long speculated about the divine towers and who could have built them, but the one detail that is clear is that they are meant to enshrine the Two Fingers that are found at the top of each of them, as if it is the creation of a civilization that worships these beings. Yet whatever preeminence Metyr enjoyed in the past is clearly long past, as the Elden Beast is now the centre of the current order and the source of the greater will's influence, as the Elden Ring. Conversely, Metyr's influence is greatly diminished, with her being long cut off from the greater will and left to rot in a forgotten corner of the lands of shadow. We also know that Metyr resents her position, given that the Ash of War of the Gazing Finger, a weapon made from her remembrance, is called Kowtower's resentment. As such, Garrulous Goldmask, in my Metyr video, argued that it is possible that Metyr was competing with the Elden Beast for power. To prove his point, Goldmask made some rather compelling arguments that could be viewed through this lens. One example was found in Corrin's dialogue, in which Goldmask highlighted the fact that if you gave him the Two Fingers prayer book, then Corrin, a man loyal to the Golden Order, would describe this book as heresy.
That is a work of heresy. Its incantations bear no lineage from the Erdtree.
To reiterate, Corrin describes the Two-Finger incantations as heresy, marking a clear delineation between Two-Finger incantations and that of the Golden Order. In fact, if you give Corrin the Golden Order Principia, then he hails it as a piece of holy work. This seems to suggest a clear distinction between the Two Fingers and the Golden Order. They are not considered one and the same by the Erdtree faithful. It makes me reconsider the Empyrean system altogether. In the past, it seemed to be a system that worked in concert with the Elden Ring, an election system where the Two Fingers choose candidates for godhood, the next custodians of the Elden Ring. Perhaps this was the case at some time, that Metyr and the Elden Beast were two cogs of the same machine, and this election process was for the stability of the Elden Ring's order. But it does make me consider when this all happened. When exactly was Metyr cut off, and when the Fingers started using this process for their own designs? The dialogues from Ymir seem to imply that Metyr has been broken at least from Marika's time, given he groups both her and the fingers together when he says broken from the start. What I find interesting is that I keep re-examining dialogue from the fingers during our journey. In one particular dialogue, they directly tell us to become Elden Lord and Marika's consort. They say the following.
The fingers speak. Marika's trespass demanded a heavy sentence. But even in shackles, she remains a god and the vision's vessel. Confer great runes to become Elden Lord and join Queen Marika as her consort. The fingers have willed it so.
Note how they say the fingers willed it so, not the greater will. This is their directive and plan. But why? Why do they recruit the Tarnished? And why do they select Empyreans for the next age if they are not being directly commanded to by the greater will? The easiest answer is that Metyr and the Fingers are doing this on behalf of the greater will, despite the absence of contact, meaning that this was the last order it gave Metyr before contact was lost, and thus she continues to carry out that order over and over. However, what if Metyr and her children select Empyreans because they are trying to re-establish their primacy over the Elden Beast and Elden Ring? Marika could have been the first attempt at this, however she was not a success story for them, for while she did indeed knock down the old order, she would ultimately become the new bearer of the Elden Beast, once again ensuring its place at the top of the Pyramid of Power. Additionally, Marika would seal the Lands of Shadow, leaving Metyr very much isolated from the Halls of Power, and so Metyr would try again, and raise up a new Empyrean, the Gloam Eyed Queen. Remember, the Gloam Eyed isn't a rogue character, she is directly risen up by the two fingers as Marika once was. Black Flame Ritual reads the following. The Gloam Eyed Queen led the Apostles. It is said that she was an Empyrean chosen by the Fingers. I think by this stage most people know my opinion on the Queen's identity. I do still firmly believe it is Melina, and I would highly recommend my video on that subject. However, for this discussion, whatever you believe regarding her identity is not hugely relevant. What is relevant is her methods and aims. They are highly aggressive, with her and her apostle followers having the direct aim of killing the gods, utilising the black god-slaying flame to do so. The Gloam Eyed Queen positions herself as a direct rival to Marika and her order, even more so than later Empyreans that try to replace Marika only after she is gone. We also need to reconsider the symbol for godskin incantations, which in the past I believed to be either a flame or an inverted palm, and there is good reason to believe so. As I discuss in a lore short, the renowned Souls translator and author Loki translates the Japanese description of Godslayer's seal as representing a palm of black flame. And this may well be the case, however, in the comments of my Metyr video, some viewers pointed out that this sigil lines up very closely with Metyr's face, perhaps a clue as to the Gloam Eyed's benefactor. If this is the case, we can see the Godskin's assault upon Marika and her kin, as one orchestrated by Metyr, as a part of its ongoing feud with the Elden Beast and Marika. It is certainly a compelling notion, even if it is a speculative theory. As I will suggest later, perhaps it was her conflict with Melina that led to Marika fearing her son Mesmer, and ultimately sealing him away. We learn from Mesmer's kindling that both he and his sister bore flame within them, and I believe this is a reference to Melina. Both Melina and Mesmer were innately associated with flame, Melina's black flame and Mesmer's abyssal flame. Both of these flames were a threat to Marika's Erdtree, as we can see Mesmer's flame is capable of dispelling the Skadu tree shroud that covers a Nair Elimb. In regards to Melina's flame, I suggested in my Gloam Eyed Queen video that the Queen was responsible for burning the Erdtree and bringing the Age of Plenty to a close. This is based on the work of Tarnished Archaeologist, who points out that Leyndell is already covered in ash before we even burn the tree, suggesting it had already been burned in the past. Additionally, TA points out that the base of the Erdtree is arboreal, whilst the upper half is a sort of golden projection, and the conclusion that he draws is that the original natural tree was burned down and replaced by this golden manifestation. This is why the Age of Plenty came to a close, and why the tree no longer produces sap, because it is not a true tree as it was before. If the Gloam Eyed was responsible for such a calamity, it would have rocked Marika and her rule to the core, and no doubt it would have Marika fearing Melina's brother, in case he too would be recruited by the Two Fingers to bring down her rule. If this is all true, then it would also mean that when the Two Fingers were guiding us to become Elden Lord, we were just the next tool at their disposal to inflict Metyr's revenge against Marika, and usurp the Elden Beast. This becomes even more insidious when you consider that the Two Fingers have churches outside the Lands Between, as if they are conditioning Tarnished to do their bidding. In general, there is a strong relationship between the Fingers and the Tarnished, and there is therefore a good chance that a Tarnished Elden Lord could restore the preeminence of Metyr and the Two Fingers. Yet there are definitely some flaws in this theory, the first being that the Two Fingers of Round Table seem to want us to repair the Elden Ring and essentially restore the Golden Order, albeit in a form of our choosing. If Metyr truly wants to usurp the Elden Beast, why would her brood encourage us to repair it? Why not tell us to destroy it completely? I don't think this necessarily defeats the theory that Metyr has set up the Empyrean system to challenge the Elden Beast, but it does raise some questions. We could argue that the Two Fingers want us to repair the Elden Ring, because we would essentially be their puppet. They are grooming all of the Tarnished, in the hopes that the next Elden Lord will be one who holds the Two Fingers in high esteem, thus restoring Metyr's influence. At the end of the day, when we defeat Radagon and the Elden Beast, Marika is a husk, Radagon has been drawn out of her and turned into a sword, and the Elden Beast is dead. Thus only we and the Fingers would remain in control of the Elden Ring, and this seems like a suitable revenge for Metyr after all. Perhaps this is a purposeful gambit made by the Greater Will, that it intentionally treated Metyr this way, so she would feel resentment and thus groom individuals to destroy the current order when it became stagnant. It would create a system of balance, where Metyr would play her role in refreshing the Elden Beast's order when it was required. Perhaps Metyr doesn't guide the Tarnished to destroy the Elden Ring, because she understands the power and role the Elden Beast plays, so instead she wants a puppet Tarnished on the throne, so she can indirectly control the Elden Ring and restore her preeminence. Metyr and the Elden Beast fit into Elden Ring's repeated dualities. Both are cosmic beings, yes, but Metyr seemingly represents sorceries, and the Elden Beast is more aligned with the holy element and incantations, gold and its shadow. This is how I reconcile the contradictions at the heart of my speculative theory. Metyr's role, as given by the Greater Will, was to select Empyreans, but that she also had personal motivations in doing so. Perhaps Metyr groomed Marika in hopes that when she took power, she would be able to control and manipulate the Queen. Instead, Queen Marika would seal away the lands of Shadow and Metyr with it, diminishing the influence of the Two Fingers and their mother. Thus she created a force of vengeance, the Gloam Eyed Queen and her godskins, to take revenge against Marika, and supplant her with a more pliable ruler. One thing we do not get any direct lore on is Marika's actual moment of ascension, and in fact the most we get on this subject is from the story trailer, which shows us a little glimpse of her deification. It also gives some tantalizing details surrounding these events, describing this original event as a seduction and betrayal. We then see Marika pulling some golden strands from a corpse that lies on the steps up the gateway. Then she ascends to the gateway herself, holding up the golden strands, and the gate reacts. We are told this is the moment that Marika became a god, and was the beginning of her system of gold and shadow. Myself and others have tried to break down what happened here numerous times, but let's try to unpack it once more. We know that each dominant power seems to have been in possession of the Elden Ring, and they had a lord and a god. We see this in the case of Placidusax and the ancient dragon civilization, the Elden Lord in a time before the Erdtree, and who was consort to a god. We see this pattern repeated when Marika comes to power, she as the god and Godfrey as the Elden Lord. But the time between the Dragon Lord's reign and Marika's rise to power is a long period, and we have long theorized on potential lords and gods between the two extremes of the timeline. Given the Hornsent were the dominant power prior to Marika, it is logical that they would have sought their own god at this time, and this is clearly the purpose of the Gate of Divinity. I would argue the very fact they have a Gate of Divinity suggests that they didn't actually yet have their own god, and Marika was able to claim its power before they did. Beyond Placidusax's god and Marika, we don't actually have any other gods confirmed, and so it is quite likely that Marika was the first true god, and Elden Ring bearer since the time of the dragons. However, that does not mean that there weren't various powers and civilizations that became dominant in this period, and the Hornsent would certainly fit that bill in the era of the Crucible. However, even if the Hornsent didn't have a god, we do still see Marika reach into the belly of a fallen foe and pull some golden strands from its corpse. So what or who is this? And what are these golden strands? Well, earlier I referenced Eric and his idea that the Gate of Divinity has power, because it gathers the inherent power within everyone into one place. It becomes concentrated. If you view the trailer with slightly higher contrast, then you can see that these golden strands are being pulled from the bodies in the gate itself. And I want to give credit to Reddit user The Senate, who first made this observation in a Reddit post, which will be linked below. But yes, as you can see, these golden strands that Marika is grasping are being pulled directly from the bodies that make up the gateway. We can also see that jar sense as trial attempts by the Hornsent to concentrate this kind of power, as one can see gold beneath the surface of the skin of the jar innards when they use a grab attack, and credit to Zlowski for providing these images, and Reddit user Admirable Example for the observation. This is why the jars are considered to be nigh saints, because they were sources of accumulated power and ultimately prototypes for the divine gateway, which would allow one access to huge reserves of concentrated power. I would therefore suggest that Marika is merely accessing the power found in the gateway itself, by drawing the concentrated runes from the amassed pile of corpses. As for the corpse that she is taking some runes from before climbing the steps, we could see this as a high-ranking or powerful Hornsent who she has killed. She then takes their significant reserves of grace to add to her power and aid her ascension. After all, is this not what we also do in our rise to power, gathering runes from the bodies of those we defeat to grow stronger? Regardless, we know from Miquella's own ascension that there are certain requirements for deification, as the secret rite scroll reads the following: a scroll made of white tree bark. Few can decipher the scroll, which describes the secret rite of the divine gateway said to be found at the tower enshrouded by shadow. A lord will usher in a god's return, and the lord's soul will require a vessel. A lord is required, and in Miquella's ascension, Radahn is that lord, and thus many have speculated about who played that role in Marika's ritual. Myself and others have speculated that Radagon was that lord, and that this was why and how he was created, that Marika played the role of both lord and god, and thus the power of the rite created Radagon within her. Again, this is in line with my old pre-Shadow of the Erdtree videos, where I state that Radagon was created at the moment of Marika's deification. Now don't get me wrong, I still think this is a valid theory. However, I do personally prefer the idea that Radagon was always a part of Marika, due to her tree nature. If that was the case, then the lord that partook in Marika's ritual could be none other than Godfrey. After all, he is the first Elden Lord, and thus it wouldn't make sense if Radagon played this role at the beginning. Godfrey being chosen by Marika at this early period does make sense, given how closely Hoarah seems to be tied to the age of the Crucible. We know from meeting Hoarah ourselves that he was a man of violence, who believed in a sort of might makes right mantra. Following Marika's ascension, she more or less immediately embarked on a campaign of conquest, in which she destroyed those who could not be assimilated and conquered those who could. The aim was ultimate Erdtree domination, and it is likely that Marika was able to draw Godfrey to her side, when she was an aspiring Empyrean with promises of conflict and conquest. However, there is more evidence when we look a bit closer that allows us to paint a picture of Godfrey's position within Hornsent civilization. In my Hornsent video, we discussed the position of the divine beast lion dancers within their society, that it is a fated position that must be earned. You must progress to being a divine beast warrior, and only those who can master the power of the storm and the dance can then become a sculpted keeper, aka a divine beast dancing lion. But the divine beast warriors themselves are a coveted position, made up of only the best horned warriors. Thus the chain of progression is from horned warrior to divine beast warrior to sculpted keeper, a divine warrior's path within Hornsent society, and honoured positions all. With that in mind, let us read the armour set of the Horned Warriors, which read the following. Armour of the Horned Warriors, Keepers of the Tower. The ochre fabric is draped over a chest piece made to resemble the unclothed form of a hero from older times. So who is this unclothed hero? Well, there is only one real warrior of significance who we know to be largely unclothed, Hoarah. I would suggest then that Hoarah was a legendary warrior to the Hornsent, and as such inspired later generations of their warriors. Additionally, Godfrey and his kin, Nefeli, are some of the only characters who wield the power of the storms, and in general similar elemental techniques that we could expect from a divine beast dancing lion. I think it is also undeniable that the Crucible Knights and the Horned Warriors have similar origins. Fundamentally, it feels similar to fight both opponents. Both are extremely hard to stagger or flinch, and both wield the power of the Crucible, and even have similar movesets. I would even go so far to suggest that the Crucible Knights are those of the Horned Warriors, who betrayed the Hornsent and joined with Marika and her new lord. For clarity, what I am suggesting is this. Godfrey was a famed warlord of Hornsent society, so much so that his physique is what the Horned Warrior's armour is modelled after. However, Marika managed to draw him and some Horned Warriors who followed him to her side in her uprising. Hoarah became Godfrey, and the treasonous Horned Warriors became the Crucible Knights, who would forever be known as the loyal blades of the first Elden Lord. Godfrey betraying the Hornsent was a grim moment for the Hornsent and their civilization, a point reinforced by the Talisman of Lord's bestowal, which reads the following. A talisman depicting Godfrey, first Elden Lord, receiving the precious sap, increases poise after using a flask of tears. The Lord accepted the sap stoically, without any sign of wavering. No wonder Lord of the Erdtree casts a long shadow over the lands. This talisman tells us that Godfrey accepted his position as Marika's lord without hesitation, and in doing so, he cast a long shadow across the Hornsent's lands, dooming them to some dark times as a result of his decision. We also have to consider Serosh, who has an undeniable similarity to the divine beast of Hornsent culture. We know that Serosh himself was already a lord prior to meeting Godfrey, and we have to consider if he held a position of respect in Hornsent society. Returning to the ingredients needed for the Gate of Divinity's rite, one needs a god, a lord, and a lord's vessel. In Miquella's case, he, Radahn, and Mohg play each of these roles respectively. In Marika's case, I now believe it was Marika, Serosh, and Godfrey who each played these roles. Let me explain the reasoning behind this. We know from the Godfrey icon that he took Serosh upon his back, so that the beast could suppress his violent and unlordly ways. Serosh becomes known as his beast regent. likely meaning he could make decisions for and on behalf of Godfrey. He was essentially his advisor and confidant. This bond is incredibly strong. It isn't just a lion sitting on a man's shoulder. Sarosh seems like he is almost partially spirit, and is missing some of his original body. And I think this is because Sarosh has truly become part of Godfrey, like an extension of him. We can perhaps find proof of this in the Roar of Regalia incantation, which reads the following: an incantation of what is jokingly called the Bear Communion, an incantation that is more akin to the divine invocation of the Horn Scent than it is to the Dragon Communion. Only through desperate battle with the feral wild can one discover a god unique to oneself. Given Godfrey was a man who believes a crown is warranted with strength, I have speculated in the past that he defeated the Lord of Beasts in battle, who then after swore loyalty to the victor. Tarnished archaeologist even points out that Godfrey's axe shares a similar model to the weapons of the Beastmen, and thus suggests that this was once the Lord of Beasts' weapon that he presented to Godfrey as a sign of fealty. But what if the process was more akin to that described in the Roar of Regalia? That man and beast had a battle so fierce, and as a result Sarosh became part of Godfrey, a Lord of Beasts, taking root in Godfrey as his vessel. With a lord attached to him, the duo could have played the role of lord and vessel. Additionally, the presence of the Lord of Beasts within Godfrey made him more lordly. Thus he was transformed from the unclothed barbarian to the righteous lord of the golden lineage. Again, I want to credit my script editor for first suggesting these ideas of Godfrey and his regent, being vessel and lord respectively, as well as a Reddit comment by Professor Smash, which compounded my understanding of these ideas, and it will be linked below. I believe that these events are the seduction and betrayal referred to in the story trailer. Marika seducing Godfrey, the Lord of Beasts, and the Crucible Knights to her side. Suddenly the humble shaman seems quite powerful, with Malekith, Godfrey, and the knights at her back to assist her in her uprising against their own people. The story trailer describes Marika's ascension as a betrayal, and this certainly gives new weight to that word. If two highly regarded individuals chose to side with a shaman upstart, alongside a good number of their warriors. When we later meet the Horn-Scent Grandam, she has some strong words to say in regards to Marika and her kin.
Listen, progeny of the Wanton's trumpet. For thy sins thou shalt have thy recompense. The sacred beast shall unleash its ire.
Strumpet is a derogatory term used against women, and could well be a reference to Marika's seduction of Godfrey to her side. A great betrayal to Horn-Scent society as a whole, given how highly Godfrey could have been regarded. Taking this all together, what do we have? Marika was one of the last surviving members of her people, most of whom were rounded up for the Horn-Scent's horrific experiments, and used to build the Gate of Divinity. Marika had likely survived due to the influence of Metyr in the Fingers, who had already granted her Malekith as a protector, and nominated her Empyrean. Marika then brought Hoarah and some of the Horned Warriors to her side, and it was this betrayal that allowed her to claim power for herself. With the Tower of Anir Ilim secured by Godfrey and his warriors, she stepped into the Gate of Divinity, completing the requirements described in the Secret Rite Scroll, and became a god. Godfrey will likely have been present in order to complete his part of the ritual, and Marika would have become a god. The power of the Elden Ring settles within her, and her new order manifests as the Erdtree and Erdtree, as a reflection of her innate tree nature. In this segment, I want to mainly discuss why Marika would declare a crusade against the Horn-Scent so late on into her rule. I have discussed the more basic details about the actual crusade itself in my Mesmer video, and so I would direct you there if you were interested in the events of the war itself. Marika's overthrowing of the Horn-Scent would later have consequences, but, as I have said in prior videos, it seems as though Marika was initially content to leave their civilization intact. despite the crimes they had perpetrated against her kind. Evidence for this comes from timeline evidence, in which there are many indicators that the Crusade would not take place until much later into Marika's rule, likely after the Wars of Liurnia, and the birth of Radagon's children with Rennala. For example, we see references to the Fell God and the Fire Giants in their war machines, meaning this took place after the War of the Giants, which itself was the closing battle of Marika's initial wars of conquest. Additionally, at the Fort of Reprimand, we can find some of Rykard's virgin abductors, meaning the Crusade could not have been launched until Rykard was alive and in his role of Praetor, thus well after Radagon's marriage to Rennala. Mesmer already knows who and what the Tarnished are, likely implying it also took place after Godfrey's tarnishing and banishment.
That tarnished, it seemeth. Mother, wouldst thou truly lordship sanction in one so bereft of light?
To conclude, Marika did not obliterate the Horn Scent at the beginning of her rule, as she did to the Fire Giants, and allowed them to persist for a long period of time, under her authority, of course. We also get further evidence of her regime's tolerance of Horn Scent culture via the item description of Festive Greece, which reads the following. The delightful festival is an old tradition, one old enough for the Erdtree to tacitly tolerate its endurance. This seemingly implies that the Erdtree authorities allowed the Horn Scent to exist as they had been, only under ultimate Erdtree rule. Additionally, there is evidence of a sort of cultural exchange, which we can see via the dueling shield. This item description implies that the gladiatorial combat customs established by Godfrey, and later erased by Radagon, also made their way to the lands of Shadow. Yet it is undeniable that there will have been some cultural chafing, as the main religion of the lands will have become the worship of Marika and the Erdtree. So while the Horn Scent will have been tolerated for a time, there likely will have been tension between the two cultures, and perhaps it is in this tension that we can find the reason behind Marika's decision to launch a crusade against them. We mentioned the Horn Scent Grandam earlier, and to me she seems to be an avatar of the Horn Scent's grudge against Marika and the Erdtree, albeit most of her ire is directed against Mesmer, and his more recent crusade against the Horn Scent. However, should one attack Grandam, she has some interesting voice lines, depending on the choices you have made. If you have previously interacted with her while wearing the Divine Beast head, then she believes you are a legit sculpted keeper, and will actually encourage you to eat her as a sacrifice, as long as it helps you in your quest to take down Mesmer and take revenge. However, it is her second combat dialogue that is of interest to us, which you get when you attack her as the Tarnished, in which she taunts you about the fate of Marika and her brood.
A curse upon the strumpet's progeny, upon Marika's children, each and all. The curse of the omen shall strike thee down in the form of the sacred beast's ire.
Grandam makes an interesting claim here, that the curse of the omen shall strike down Marika's children. Now it is clear that the horned beings known as the Omen are similar to the Horn Scent. Both have horns that grow from their flesh, and both of these conditions seem to be rooted in the power of the Crucible. It is also clear that things associated with the Crucible would become slowly hated as the era of the Erdtree advanced, with Marika's people seeing it as an uncouth reminder of a more primitive past. However, I have always wondered how the Omen condition spreads. How did these individuals come into contact with the Crucible? We know that in regards to the Horn Scent, that the lands they inhabited, the lands of Shadow, were deeply connected to the power of the Crucible, such as described by the item description of the Bloom Incantation or Beast Horn, the latter of which reads the following. Found by hunting horned beasts of the realm of Shadow. The Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns despite the characteristics of their species. So it is no mystery as to how they grew their horns. But what of the omen of the lands between? The way in which the omen are dealt with in Marika's realm makes it feel like an outbreak or epidemic, in which doctors desperately try all sorts of treatments to curb the spread, before eventually resorting to killing the infected. What if this condition spread because there was a curse placed upon Marika by the horn scent, and the omen curse manifested on two of her children, Mohg and Morgott? This would fully explain Grandam's dialogue, in which she is essentially claiming that Marika's bloodline would be afflicted with a curse. There are some additional ties to be made. The Omen have powers in which they can unleash a brown magic that homes in on their enemies. This is very similar in appearance to the Watchful Spirit incantation, which Grandam uses to defend herself, perhaps reinforcing the notion that the Omen condition is the result of a purposeful, horn-scent curse. These spirits seem to be a guardian spirit to her kind, and interestingly we know that the cursed Omen of the lands between were haunted by spirits in their dreams. We learn this from the Omen Killer's mask, which reads the following: "This visage is carved in the image of the evil spirits that haunt the Omen in their nightmares." What if the vengeful spirits of the horn scent are those that haunt those with the Omen curse, and it is a condition brought about by the same? This already makes it quite a torturous state of being. However, we have to further consider the implications it had for the Erdtree faithful. Part of their faith is being buried and reabsorbed by the Erdtree. However, the seedbed curse item description, a pox which brings about the curse, makes it clear that the Omen curse severs the connection between victim and Erdtree. It is essentially being denied entry to heaven, and removing oneself from the divine grace of the Erdtree. No wonder people began to fear and revile the Omen. Better to slaughter them lest you catch this unholy condition yourself. Two of Marika's proud golden lineage were afflicted with this, her own divine line severed from her Erdtree, and hidden out of embarrassment. For surely Marika's own children being cursed would have caused a scandal. A fitting revenge orchestrated by those among the Hornscent who never forgot Marika's betrayal of seducing one of their great heroes, stealing the Gate of Divinity and usurping their position in society. Despite her allowing them to live, perhaps many could not stomach living under the rule of a lowly shaman, one who rose up and overthrew them long ago, a fact they would never forget. I therefore speculate that it was this curse that drove Marika to call a crusade against the Hornscent, unable to suffer this slight against her very bloodline. The presence of Omen Killers in the Lands of Shadow show they were part of the Crusade, reinforcing the idea that the Golden Order would have already been dealing with the Omen Curse outbreak by the time the Crusade took place, and so the timeline matches up with the suggestion that the spread of the curse was the trigger for the Crusade. She would also use this opportunity to deal with another thorn in her side, her son Metyr, whose dark elements she had begun to fear. Perhaps this was not only driven by her son's abyssal serpent, a force of darkness, but also because by this stage she will have already fended off the Gloam Eyed Queen, who I speculate to be Metyr's sister, Melina. Both were children of fire, and fire has always been a threat to the Erdtree, and thus Marika could well have seen Metyr as someone who could emerge as a potential rival. Metyr would be chosen by his mother to lead this crusade, a crusade that is clearly based on a dogma that the Hornscent are lesser, beings untouched by grace. Metyr dutifully undertook this grim task and obliterated what remained of Hornscent society, and yet his mother sealed him and his army here, killing many birds with a single stone. The Hornscent were killed in retribution for their curse. The Gate of Divinity was sealed and hidden. Her dangerous son was out of reach, and the truth of her ascension would now be a well-kept secret. All of Marika's actions here, though despotic, are clearly a result of her trying to maintain her rule and protect her brood. So that is my take on Marika's lore that is found in Shadow of the Erdtree. All my other thoughts regarding her rule as God, the Golden Order, and the Shattering can already be found in my prior videos on Marika and these subjects. I think Shadow of the Erdtree added a lot of really interesting lore, and alongside Metyr and Baal, Marika's new lore is perhaps my favourite addition. I love how mystical her people were. The nature of the Shamans explains so much about Marika's association with trees, as well as some of the stranger elements of her nature and that of her offspring. Perhaps the most poetic element of her story comes from the fact that she and her people were once oppressed, and yet her own order would repeat this cycle. I think it's clear that perhaps in the early days of Marika's rule, when the benefits were plenty, that her order was kind. But ultimately it would fall to the same pitfalls that her predecessors did, with the game explicitly highlighting the similarities between the two orders. Perhaps even more perversely, Marika revives the very practice of the horn scent that led to the extermination of her own people. Albeit, in Marika's time this is seemingly a tool to recycle life and deliver deceased material to the Erdtree, and yet it still seems wildly disrespectful to her own people. The nature of her order is further challenged when we discover the truth of her divinity and Metyr. In the base game it is clear that Marika's subjects believe that she is the one true god, chosen by the greater will to have a divine mandate. However, both of these pillars are deconstructed by the secrets found in the Lands of Shadow. We learn that she wasn't chosen by the greater will directly, as Metyr and her two-finger children have long lost contact with it. Additionally, Marika isn't truly the one eternal god. Her godhood is created and is recreatable, a truth that, if known, could lead to any number of rivals repeating the process and claiming power for themselves. I believe it is these inconvenient truths that led Marika to seal the Lands of Shadow. It was to protect herself and maintain the illusion of her divinity. Yet Miquella would uncover the truth of her past and try to engineer his own rise to power, via the exact same methods that his mother used, and ultimately this is the strength of Shadow of the Erdtree's poetry. One final side bit of lore I want to talk about is Eagly, the great serpent that Rykard was devoured by and merged with. In past videos we have discussed how there is an interesting object placement, that of a shed serpent skin, found at Bonny Village. This is clearly meant to make us think of the skin of Eagly found at his temple, except it is quite a bit smaller. Now we may be tempted to relate it to Mesmer and his internal abyssal snake, but I think it is hard to ignore that this skin is essentially identical to Eagly's other one. Thus I am inclined to believe this object placement is a hint as to Eagly's past. So let's analyse what this could potentially tell us about the Great Serpent's history. Firstly, the skin is much smaller than the one found in the temple, and smaller than Eagly's final form. Thus our first conclusion is that Eagly was younger when he was here. Next, the location. Bonny Village. Why would Eagly be here? Well, we know that Eagly is the Great Devourer, a serpent who wants to consume all for its own power. By the end, when combined with Rykard's own psychology, the serpent wishes to devour the gods and the Erdtree. Yet these are lofty goals it takes on when it is at the peak of its power, and combined with Rykard's own goals. It surely had to start smaller in order to grow stronger. Then we consider what Bonny Village is, the location of the potentates, where they butchered the victims who would end up in the jars. This would mean that there would be a large amount of offal and discarded flesh for a small, hungry snake to feast upon. There is also something else I want to say about the serpent. I have long mused on the serpent's relationship to the Erdtree, given the item description of the duelist's helm, which reads the following. The snake is viewed as a traitor to the Erdtree, and the audience delighted in seeing these bronze effigies beaten and battered. The fact the serpent is viewed as a traitor could very well be because of Mesmer, who Marika could have laid the blame of the Crusade upon as justification for her sealing him away. However, given Eagly's likely presence here in the Lands of Shadow, is it not possible he was an early ally of Marika? While we know Metyr and her fingers were the ones to guide Marika to godhood, Perhaps Eagle was an early ally in her rise to power. Thus we have the basis for him being considered a traitor. In time, Metyr and her two fingers would raise up the Gloam Eyed Queen to replace Marika. And as Tarnished Archaeologist suggests in his video, it is possible Eagle also joined in this uprising. This could explain the serpentine nature of the godskins and the presence of a godskin noble in Eagle's temple, seemingly fighting alongside the serpent in its newest form. Both events, the godskins and Rykard's rebellion, could be seen as betrayals of the serpent against the Erdtree, who could have once been one of Marika's earliest allies, who came with her from the lands of Shadow. It is certainly food for thought, and for more discussion on Messmer's abyssal serpent, I would direct you to that video. So there we have it, folks. That is my take on Marika and the nature of her shaman people. A fascinating culture that finally explains so much about some of the greater mysteries of the game. But with that said, I would love to hear your thoughts below. What is your interpretation of the Shamans? Also, I would love to hear what you would like me to cover next. I am considering revisiting both Rykard and Godric, given our newest conclusions about grafting. I would like to thank my members and patrons who help keep the channel going, and whose names will be on screen now. If you would like to gain additional benefits, like seeing videos early, or seeing behind the scenes content, then consider checking out the links below. But until next time guys, I will see you in Bonnie Village, take care, and have a wonderful evening.